Get us started because we have a lot to discuss. So, welcome everyone, both my esteemed, brilliant panelists and all of these incredible colleagues who are joining and listening into this conversation today. We are going to be talking about the messy middle, the connective tissue of food systems and climate work, which is how we mobilize and use this brilliant tool of philanthropy. I'm Eva Goulbourne. I'm the CEO and founder of Littlefoot Ventures, which is a food systems and sustainability consultancy. So my work squarely sits within the world of both food and climate, and a lot of my work focuses on philanthropic advising for family foundations, family offices, corporates, nonprofits, and everyone in between. And so this is a real treat for me in this conversation with these colleagues because all of this is so relevant and urgent in this work. So, as a point of some housekeeping notes for everyone as well, we have about the next hour for our participants. Even though we can't see or hear you, a few asks or offers to you. One, introduce yourself in the chat. Who are you? Where are you from? Where are you dialing in from today? And even what's your access point to philanthropy? Are you a funder? Are you looking for funding? Are you just curious about this space? So not only would we love to learn and understand more about you, even though we can't see you, please feel free to introduce yourself. And since this is a stacked cast, I want to make sure that we have about 10 minutes or so towards the end of the discussion to get some questions from those of you listening in. So feel free to liberally put those in the chat as well. My colleagues will be helping me to sort of monitor that. And in the likely event that we won't get to each and every one of your thoughtful questions, I and my team are going to commit to making sure that we at least attempt to answer all of them in our thank you and follow-up note to all of you. So even if we don't get to them in today's conversation, I think it's just a really important moment for us to make sure that we are able to support and continue this conversation. And to my colleagues too, it looks like it appears the chat is disabled. So Megan or Stacey, maybe you can help offer that to folks just so that they can be able to do what I've invited them to do. But without further ado, let's get into it. We are, again, talking about climate philanthropy and this moment of why food systems. For some of you, you may be already food systems experts, sort of operating in this space from that context. But food systems our global food system is at a tipping point, and this creates both, of course, a challenge and an opportunity. About 34% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our food system, and food-related emissions projected to rise by 50% over the next 25 years. This is something that needs to be addressed, and the acknowledgement that food and climate are inextricably linked is really important in these conversations. Lots of funders in this space who are focused on climate action do so through energy solutions like microgrids or fracking alternatives, but food systems is often overlooked in this work, despite the fact that, according to Project Drawdown, the top two solutions to reduce global temperatures by the necessary 2 degrees Celsius are both food-related solutions, reducing food loss and waste, and shifting towards plant-rich diets. So we know from both intuitively and from the data that in order to address the climate crisis, we must do so through food systems transformation. And within that context, climate philanthropy and the climate crisis is reshaping the funding landscape, especially in these trying political times. Government grant funding is becoming increasingly tenuous and sort of unclear for a lot of countries and regions. And so the urgency for other private philanthropic dollars to come to the table has never been greater. And just something sort of final for us to think about within this context too is the public climate finance in this space has doubled from about 300 billion to 640 billion over the last 5-ish years, but only about 3% has been focused on food systems. So again, this indicator that there's dollars here, but the dollars are not going to the solutions that really are what are going to tip the scale for all of us. So hopefully that gives everyone a sort of grounding point for this conversation and why we believe that philanthropy is such a critical opportunity in this space. So we'll be discussing all of those different points with my amazing panelists in this moment right now. So I want to quickly introduce them, my panelists, so that they can get to their wisdom in this space as well. So Sarah Howard, welcome, my friend. Sarah is the managing director of the Global Philanthropy Forum, and so she'll really be speaking from despite the fact that Sarah, in her own right, is very much a foodie and food systems person, the philanthropy work that she does spans all spaces. So her wisdom from the philanthropic lens generally is going to be really valuable in this conversation. And the Global Philanthropy Forum itself is continuing to expand its global influence in this space, knowing that they have a really unique opportunity to equip donors with knowledge and networks and insights to help empower them to drive the meaningful change that they intend to do. Tania Strauss, my old friend, dear friend, and a expert in her absolute own right, is the head of food and water for the World Economic Forum. Hello, dear Tania. And she leads a variety of high impact global initiatives all across the global supply chain that we'll be hearing about in a moment. And Tania is really valuable in the context of multi-stakeholder collaboration, how amidst a variety of different stakeholders, philanthropy can offer that connective tissue. And so she'll be sharing from that perspective. Shalini Unnikrishnan, my friend from Boston Consulting Group, she's managing director and partner there. And she's going to be sharing with us the work that she spearheads as part of the Action Agenda for Regenerative Landscapes, which is a global initiative of 35 organizations that was launched at COP28. And the work that she's been doing has been groundbreaking and a really great example of bringing blended finance to scale in the regenerative landscape space. So she's going to be sharing from that perspective, and in particular, her work and her team's work in Brazil, in the Cerrado, which is for those of you who don't know, a critical battleground of agricultural production and livestock. And then last but not least, my friend James Mwangi, founder and CEO of Africa Climate Ventures and founder of the Climate Action Platform for Africa. So as you hopefully are now seeing, we're going to have a little bit of the whole globe in this conversation today to bring different perspectives from each of you. So with that, Sarah, just very briefly starting with you and your perspectives, like we mentioned, you are the voice of philanthropy in this space, and the vast network that you manage addresses a variety of different impact areas. What signals from funders are you seeing that indicate this growing interest in food systems? And how does this shift start to affect and impact where they're starting to either continue to put natural resource dollars or starting to?
Yes, thank you, Eva. I think to just jump in on answering questions, I'll give a little bit of context for Global Philanthropy Forum. We're on a mission to make philanthropy fit for purpose in the 21st century. And a huge part of that is taking more of an ecosystems approach to funding. And when you do that, you start to naturally break down what have been more traditional silos for grant making. And those silos have, in a food systems context, sort of put different groups in different places when that is not necessarily helpful in this context of like the system itself needs to transform. So we're really encouraging greater coordination and collaboration that happens across those grant making areas. So a big part of that is how can we help bring stakeholders together who haven't typically had that conversation, so that they can see the crossover points. Oh, if I'm funding X area that's having a co-benefit over another area, maybe it can actually enhance that co-benefit. That's a really small example. Or stepping back even further, looking at, oh, if I shift some of the strategy around the funding, I could have a more systems based approach to where those dollars go, which increases impact. So sometimes it might be just a strategy shift. Sometimes it might be an increase in funding itself based on looking at the systems side of things. But generally, we're hoping that there's more of this collaboration cohort sort of approach, at least coordination, because what we know for sure is that increased knowledge sharing will always strengthen the ecosystem. And that's one of the things that we really like firmly stand on. And so helping others that wouldn't think of themselves as part of the food system is how we make that stronger. So that's like a very quick, simple sort of explanation on our side.
Thank you, Sarah. And I should mention too, Sarah's my co-hostess with the mostess in this
Mhm.
conversation today as well. So grateful to have a powerhouse philanthropy voice in parallel to this conversation. Tania, from your perspective, you manage the entire food and ag and water portfolio at the forum. For those of our colleagues who don't know, you do this almost exclusively through multi-stakeholder partnerships across the food supply chain. And in parallel, you have a very powerful philanthropic platform at the forum. How are you seeing the unique role that philanthropy can play in your work?
Well, thanks so much, Even. I'm excited by the chat as well, just to see so many interested parties at the table, because I think that is, as Sarah just pointed out, really well what it's going to take. I mean, maybe just to further strengthen the context that you put in the beginning, food systems, which is still a pretty new concept. So we're not talking about ag production, but food systems understood holistically represent like over 12% of global GDP, right? So this is not an insignificant sector or agenda. It's just not fully understood because it takes place in such localized contexts and often, as you said, Sarah, is very fragmented in the way we think about it, right? I think it took us the last 15 years to just set up a view on the value chain as a production farm to fork sort of view, but actually the food system represents so much more than that. Over 40% of the jobs globally are somehow connected into our food system. So this is really a backbone of how we think about the future prosperity, both economically, socially, and politically, of every country, every company, and every community on Earth. So I just wanted to sort of re-emphasize that overlooking it is often, troublesome because it is so connected into some of the shared goals that we have, whether it's through philanthropic financing or whether it's through multi-stakeholder partnerships. And then I think at the nexus of sort of climate and nature, and I'll emphasize, I'm really proud that the forum has brought food and water together because it's been a deliberate convergence of what otherwise are often siloed topics to say, food is contributing to a third of the challenges and emissions, but it's also the biggest client of freshwater withdrawals. And then, as we flip that script to say, how do we reverse deforestation and biodiversity loss, and all of these different issues, we can start to make gains across all of those by looking at food differently. And so what does that mean in terms of the context of the current financial kind of landscape? And Eva, you talked, I think, really well about this 3% of the fiscal support going now from the public sector into food, which is grossly, not underscoring the importance public and policymakers put on food systems at a national level. And we're seeing that across the board. We know the EU published their sort of new strategy on food and agriculture in the EU. This is top of mind for policymakers around the world, but they need support and they need partnerships and partners at the table that are able to bring that kind of expertise beyond just the resources, because this is going to take all of us to solve. But I think what's exciting about the conversation today is how are we seeing different modalities or forms of that collaboration sort of coming together? I think what we are probably most familiar with are public-private partnerships, which are often companies, governments, and possibly a third party. I think what's sort of on the cutting edge now of these, what you're describing as multi-stakeholder partnerships, are really around public, private, and philanthropy that are looking at the much more coordinated use of, I would say, capital, but also expertise. It's so much more than just the financial contributions. It is around understanding what the agendas of these different communities can be, how to bring that together, have more resourcing and expertise around the table, and then apply that in very localized ways. I think something Sarah said that resonates with me around this fit for purpose objective. And I do a lot of work with Shalini on a program called the Food Innovation Hubs, which is all about the role of technology, which in agriculture and food, we've really not benefited from in the same way other sectors have, but trying to understand that there's not one world food system. There are food systems around the world. And as you take on that much more localized view, the importance of that technology or that innovation or any kind of solution needs to have that fit for purpose objective. And you can't get that with one sector taking the lead. You need everyone around the table. You need the farmers. You need the views from the local SMEs. You need the innovator pipeline growing, and you need the companies and the governments and the philanthropy at the table. And once you have that sort of much more robust and diverse set of views, all of a sudden that adoption, which is often the biggest barrier to move from where we are to where we need to be, starts to become a very different pace and scale. So happy to get into more specifics, Eva, because I know you don't want to talk in the sort of 30,000-foot level, but I think it's important for people to understand that food is at the nexus of these various agendas, which we all share, right? So like politics might be changing, the science isn't, and we need to continue to look at that multifaceted set of things that food touches and how to invest in food in a multifaceted way.
Thank you, Tania, and so many valuable builds to this conversation, especially in emphasizing one, the economic opportunity and the reminder around that our food system holds. Oftentimes there is that disconnect of and you alluded to this too, that food systems, one, is not actually a monolith, even though in some contexts we're addressing it that way. Two, it involves all of these other industries, including, energy and infrastructure. And so it's oftentimes sort of overlooked because it's embedded within those. And I think it's really important that you're emphasizing, sort of aside from people's views or values around climate or even interest in food security, it is part of the economic opportunity. And I think that's an area for philanthropy to lean into and actually sort of be a part of, instead of just, of course, there's value in the social impact, but leaning into the value of dollars to be saved, dollars to be made, and dollars to be protected in this space. And also the fact that and we're going to have a few questions around this as well, emphasizing the fact that philanthropy serves a purpose for dollars, sure, of course, but the strategic value and the non-financial additional perspective and offerings that philanthropy brings into this space is grossly underutilized, and how we elevate that in these conversations. So thank you for sort of building on what we just shared. Shalini, from your perspective, you are focused on this global regenerative agricultural transition set of work, and you have a lot to share around the sort of value of climate change integrated into this, and farmer resilience. But scaling this solution seems to be quite significant and quite a hurdle. What's it going to take for us to accelerate this transition, and how can philanthropy play a role in driving that meaningful change?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with all of you, so many friends, and an important topic. Obviously, as BCG, we work on this with the public sector, the private sector, the social sector, and from our kind of intersection point, that vantage point, have various collaborations that we're looking to support. Tania, the one we work on together on Food Innovation Hub, for instance. The one, Eva, that I want to maybe take a minute on is to talk about this question of scale, and the action agenda for regenerative landscapes as an example of how we're trying and working on a new model to drive that, to drive action and scale. So if you take Regen Ag, the practices around it have been around for a really long time. The data has been continuing to build that this is an important part, not just for mitigation, but equally important for resilience. As we focus on soil health, it becomes a really critical part of how we build resilience for farmers, for their communities, and for the food system more broadly. But scale has been a real challenge. And to Tania's point, it is not a singular challenge everywhere. It's very localized challenges. So as we pulled together this action agenda for regen landscapes, which is chaired by BCG, WBCSD, the UN high-level champions, and the COP presidency, there were a couple of kind of key thesis points. One was we needed players from across the value chain, across the ecosystem to come together and take action together. Not one or two partners, not one or two collaborations, but really how do you do a place-based approach, but bring in multiple players into it at the same time into that place. So localized, place-based kind of approach. The second is to actually not start with a commodity lens or a particular project lens, but to start from the farmer's lens. What are all the things that that farmer is engaged in with his assets, being the soil? And what are all the assets that that landscape, that ecosystem produces? And how do we take that holistic lens to make that transformation? This is really critical for scale because what we found in getting these 40-ish companies and organizations that have joined, all of them have shared their data on their projects with us and we keep them in a data clean room and we do analysis on them. There's about nearly 400 million hectares worth of project data in there, about 6 billion of resources that these organizations, these companies are either spending or planning to spend over the next few years in their projects. Quite sizable number of efforts, 300 plus efforts going on around the world. But what we find is that they're all sort of like, hey, it's me and another person and me and another partner, but it's not necessarily a holistic view. And that's what we're hoping to drive to with this action agenda is to take each landscape, each biome. You mentioned the Cerrado where we're doing work, which is a massive biome, and to really think about what is the overall transformation. And the main insight from that we've unlocked in looking at it from a farmer-centric view is from a capital point of view, we need not individual pieces of capital. We need the whole financing stack to come together for a farmer to feel confident to start to make those transitions. Some of that is first loss capital, and concessionary capital. Some of that is private capital and has great IRR. So in the Cerrado, we have 15 to 30% IRR on the existing land from this transformation, and a really good NPV in a longer term horizon of like $100 billion in that large biome. So the spends are large, but at the same time there is a return horizon. But what we need is for multiple forms of capital to come together to realize that value. What that means for philanthropy is if you're a single philanthropist that is writing checks for individual projects, what you really want to be able to do is join up with some of these kind of global efforts where you can stack your dollars with others or pounds or whatever the currency may be with others to drive a holistic place-based transformation. And that is how we're going to get, especially in today's context, where we are seeing, quite a disruption in the ODI flows and so on in the world. This concept of needing to stack our various forms and flows of capital becomes even more important, and a place-based approach becomes even more important. And that's what we're trying to accomplish with this action agenda.
That's great, Shalini. Thank you for sharing that context, and we'll get in a moment to some of the specifics of that too, to sort of use the Regenerative Landscapes project that you're leading to demonstrate specifically where and how philanthropy can play either both a project-based role, but also that strategic longer-term role that all of us have started to allude to. So I appreciate that. And certainly last but not least, James, from your perspective, I would love to sort of know, you are operating on the African continent, and there is a lot of unique challenges and opportunities both within the climate agenda and also addressing food insecurity, food loss and waste, climate tech, all of those different components. And I would maybe argue too, in a very different context than somewhere like a South America, very different than Southeast Asia or Europe or North America. If you could share with us a little bit more about your thesis at Africa Climate Ventures and sort of how that plays a role for you in the influence for you in terms of where that capital injection should go.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. And it's an interesting time right now to be in a business whose name literally has Africa in it. Right now, not many investors or deployers of capital are long on it. Climate suddenly has apparently become a controversial thing to be working on. And venture financing in frontier markets also, So I'm kind of carrying a triple whammy here, on some level. And then you turn to the food system and working on the continent that has been uh, perhaps slower than, has not stepped into the 20th century version of the Green Revolution, very synthetic fertilizer and industrial agriculture based production boosts, right? So if you look at Africa, when you were doing work on the continent and, in your previous guys and even now, a lot of the challenges are just how do we just become nutritionally self-sufficient? Now you add another complication. How do you do that without extensifying agriculture at the expense of natural biomes that we need to preserve for the climate? And you go a step further than that is how do you do that in a financially sustainable way on a continent where most countries' first, second, or third largest import is synthetic imported fertilizer? And I think if you take all of that together and all of the imperatives around rural livelihoods, around equitable access, etc., you suddenly realize there's so many kind of pressures pushing that it's very easy to end up doing too little against too many different things. And what you actually need is a little bit of a connecting through thread. One of the ones that I found really exciting is actually taking some of those constraints and asking to what extent are they actually opportunities? To what extent is the fact that, given that the Green Revolution type agricultural system is responsible for a non-trivial portion of global emissions from fertilizer production, for example, has proven to be harmful to the long-term health of soils, which is why we are embracing regenerative agriculture and so on and so forth. To what extent has Africa's slower embrace of it created an opportunity to immediately embrace and very quickly accelerate uptake of regenerative practices and regenerative inputs? And so, for example, we're investing in the deployment of biochar-based organic fertilizer. And suddenly you realize a couple of things about that simple intervention. One, and again, very happy in subsequent questions to explain what all this is. But one, it has biochar in it, which is a carbon removal. When you make biochar out of waste biomass, you're actually taking net, you're durably storing carbon away in the soil. You're also improving the soil's ability to hold water over time, its ability to to support soil organic carbon. There's a whole range of good things that come with that. The second thing is when you use locally available nutrients in organic fertilizer, you're recycling nutrients that are already in the region, and you're limiting the amount of synthetic fertilizer that you need to import. That's good for the local economy because you're turning that previously money that was spent on essentially embodied imported foreign natural gas in the form of fertilizer, you're turning into local jobs in actually turning organic biomass into a well-performing fertilizer.
Mhm.
And in that whole process, you're increasing both resilience and mitigation. So you're boosting domestic economic activity, you're localizing production, you're boosting self-sufficiency at a time when these currencies in African countries are under massive pressure due to all of the changes we're seeing around the world. And all of that means that very suddenly a solution that you'd think would probably be something that would largely be driven with a developmental mandate could potentially stand up on its own 2 feet as a very attractive from day one commercial intervention that,
Yes.
because so few farmers can afford fertilizer in the first place, actually ends up in a net boost of yields versus what you see in a lot of other places where in the near term transitioning from an old regime to a regenerative regime, you see a drop in yield.
Yeah.
So there is this opportunity to figure out how do you scale up these types of distributed climate smart solutions that make use of localized pools of resources, labor, and capacity, and take advantage of the fact that where you don't have well established, kind of commercially high performing systems, it's a lot easier to go, in a sense, green from the start, go high performing green from the start. So that's how I'm trying to say, well, there's a lot of strikes against what we're trying to do, but behind each of those is a little bit of an edge that could allow African agriculture to become not just climate neutral, but ideally climate positive. And that's even before we start talking about, that's talking about what's in the pot. That's before we start talking about what's under the pot in terms of heating solutions and the future of cooking and so on, which is a conversation for another time.
Yes, for part two. James, thank you. And that's such a valuable scene setter for, again, that sort of comparison of regions too, because in what you're saying, um, and again, I hope you don't rebrand Africa Climate Ventures, despite, as you're saying, some of those knocks against you. Huge opportunity to leapfrog, learn from maybe the mistakes, possibilities, opportunities from other regions, and be very precise and intentional with the investment and the priority solutions that are brought into the food and ag space there. So thank you for that. I want to just keep us moving because we're vibing, we're flowing, we're exactly sort of where we need to be. I want to talk about risk and de-risking. I almost said de-risking risk, de-risking this space rather, since it was the title of this webinar and a lot of the focus of our work. It is often philanthropy is often positioned, I think very appropriately so, as the opportunity to de-risk food systems investments. But what does that actually look like in practice? So again, we've also talked about sort of we're saying food systems as a monolith, but it's definitely not. And so before we go into that question too, I also want to acknowledge that we're talking about regenerative, we're talking about biochar and food loss and waste in what our panelists are sharing. And many of you who are doing work in this space who are listening to this conversation, you may be focused on child nutrition and school meals. You may be focused on different types of innovation in this space. You may be focused on food recovery, food banks, and a lot of other sort of solutions. So even though we may not touch on each of those in this conversation, the context and insights and value of this conversation are so applicable for each of these. So I don't want you to feel like you're excluded from this conversation. Of course, it's just the impossibility of having each of those solutions addressed within this. So I did just want to mention that. But using philanthropy to de-risk, what does that actually mean? So maybe even sharing some examples from Tania and then maybe Shalini in terms of like help us understand what we're talking about when we say that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And James, I really appreciate how compelling your comments are because I think that healthy balance of mission, purpose, and competitiveness, if I can add it on there, is I think
Business case.
amazing drivers, right? They're so motivating. And that's I think it starts to make the point around what we need. And maybe I would add, and you probably are, have that already in the composition, this sort of idea around expertise, science, and evidence base. And maybe that's where I'll start with my example. I think the the biggest factor in de-risking is about building confidence. So how do we have not necessarily the pilots, but the proof points that allow bigger interventions from large-scale private investment and policy to come in and really move the market in the direction it needs to go. So in my experience, and because Shalini's here, I'm totally going to use some of our joint works examples. I think, there's both small and big ways to do that. So for example, the Food Innovation Hub's Global Initiative is this platform that's now been running for a couple of years. It really just takes a closer look at the role of technology, the fact that we haven't really been able to mainstream technological advances within the wider food system space, and think about why that is. And funnily enough, yes, we've got all kinds of things in there from the tech side, like AI and machine learning and all protein, progress. But the real ingredient is way less sexy. It's all about having the right folks around the table and making that localized context be the sort of catalyst for being fit for purpose. And I'm sure from the folks that are dialed in, that that's not good enough to translate into sort of a bank or a large company or a government sort of adopting that practice. So you have to show that proof point. And I think what we've seen in places like Colombia, in Madhya Pradesh, and India is the role of the catalytic financing. If it's coming from a sort of classic philanthropic partner or sort of a blended finance source of multiple partners, it just allows the sort of initial phase of some of this collaboration to really show proof of concept. So in Colombia, the Food Innovation Hubs, which is hosted at CIAT, one of the CGIAR institutions working on tropical agriculture, we were able to bring together off-takers of specific commodities, the farmers' organizations, the government, and many other partners that were locally relevant for this, as Shalini says, landscape or sort of geography context, and talk about what was needed. And of course, from the off-taker's perspective, they were thinking, okay, well, I need this commodity to work for this time period, and I need this to work for me. And I thought something beautiful in that story was that the farmer organization was like, why are you solving for commodities? Solve for me, right? So when you solve for me, all of a sudden you've got a basket of crops that I'm growing on a multi-year basis. And when you start to have that view as your problem statement, and then you have CIAT hosting it, so they've got the sort of science and evidence-based, I would say technology, but also sort of solution menu that can start to look at different ways in which then all of a sudden the offtake was in a very different context and a very different conversation. You had IT providers like Microsoft and others saying, okay, well, now it's not only a smallholder one by one, farm issue. It's a much more at scale set of conditions that we're willing to invest in from an AI perspective. And so all of a sudden you start to see the gears moving, but we wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't have the initial catalytic financing that set up the host of that partnership that was able to bring together those stakeholders that were able to determine what the fit for purpose solutions would be. And now that group, if I may, since you invited me to this and I'm known for my candidness of what's going on geopolitically. So when some funders back out, that group has the resilience to be able to offset some of the gaps in funding that they were receiving from that and just say, look, but we've got the right value proposition. We have the right assurance and confidence in the direction of this. We're going to offset some of that financing and let's go. And that just happened yesterday. So those kinds of programs, I think we're seeing those pop up in different regions. In the MP, it was a lot more focused on SME involvement and exposing the government to the kind of investment required to build pipelines of innovation around technological solutions in agriculture. And once they saw the proof in the pudding, which was supported initially by Gates Foundation, they were able to actually institutionalize those as public-private partnership schemes within their ministry, right? And now that's taking off in a very different scale than if we as the sort of, initiating partner, we're going to continue to chip away at this small pilot activity. So that's the kind of unlock, I think, that's available. Obviously, there are many more examples with different levels of scale. I chose those two because I feel like it's as straightforward as that. I think it's exactly what Shalini was saying around really bringing the folks around the table and understanding where their capital sits and how it works together, and how that catalytic sort of risk up front, that no one's willing to sort of go out there except for one or two people out there and just help bridge that sort of part of the the equation, and then you can really see the proof in the pudding. So it's really around those proof points.
Tanya, thank you. You can see we're all vigorously nodding and shaking our head of like, yes, 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 yes. And such a valuable point to in the initial part of what you were saying to the reminder around the farmer focus and remembering who we're in service to, and the fact that farmers are by design vulnerable in that they're price takers and not price makers. And this idea that there may be sort of lack of understanding of the type of support that they actually need within this. And then your point around the financing resilience, I think, is so important too, of, when the rug might be pulled out from under certain projects, again, especially in this moment in time, how do we withstand that in these projects to keep the momentum and keep the system going? So I appreciate that. Shalini, I want to hear from you as well on this and sort of how you're seeing that within the AARL project as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's Tanya and I have always have a mind melt, and hence we end up working together so much. But this idea, as I mentioned, the whole construct of ARL started with being place-based and with starting with farmer-centric, right? So it's not a single commodity. It's not starting from the farmer and saying, what do they need to make the transition? And so the first place we looked at where our members' interests was in Brazil and in the Cerrado. Now, Cerrado itself is massive, right? We're talking about 200 million hectares. It harbors about 30% of Brazil's biodiversity, has about 25% of the world's soy. So we're not talking about a small place. It's a biome with multiple landscapes within it. Now, as we looked at that and we looked at the data, there were hundreds of players who were trying to do lots and lots of little projects. And most of them haven't even met each other, right? So the average number of partners is about 1.4. And everyone's basically got another half partner and trying to do something small. And it's like a laundry list of little initiatives and projects. But that's not what's going to bring capital in at scale. That's not what's going to drive transformation at scale in this region. So the work we're doing there was actually to say, okay, how do we take the power of this coalition that we've got, which has got many of the global players, the PepsiCo, Nestle, Danone's, and Unilever's, and so on, but also ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, Olam, John Deere, Bayer, right? Like all of the big players in this mix, a bunch of Brazilian players in the mix, and then organizations like Nature Conservancy and World Farmers Organization, etc. How do we take the power of this kind of non-state actors group and combine that with what the government is trying to do and see if we can create a playbook or an approach for how this kind of large-scale collaboration could happen? And that's what we've been working on. So we, with the Ministry of Agriculture, developed a roadmap for the Cerrado with input from farmer organizations and farmers, with analytical, capabilities put into that, with geospatial mapping and so on and so forth, with data from the supply chain players, etc., to say what are the different parts of the Cerrado, what kind of transition support will they need, what is the cost of that transition, what is the capital stack that is needed in each part of the Cerrado to make it happen, what is the time horizon for that return, and what is the rate of that return. Now, having that starting construct, which we're going to publish that soon with ministry, etc., what that gives us is a framework, a scaffolding within which multiple players can then come together and say, here's the part that I can do. And we've broken the financing down into what is concessional capital or philanthropic or, first loss type of capital versus what could be done actually with good rates of return with private capital versus what could be brought in with public finance. And there's about 15% of the stack of capital that is needed from concessional and philanthropic capital.
Yeah.
Now, that could be sprinkled across the whole thing, or there is an opportunity like in April, for instance, we are hosting the minister himself is going to be hosting a forum in the Cerrado to bring players that are finance, supply chain players from our action agenda, local Brazilian ones as well as global ones, to come together to talk about how do we take our different pieces and stack them together, and how do we work together on that, towards, with COP30 as being sort of a milestone to help us figure that out. That playbook of how we've analyzed it, how we've laid out that roadmap, and how we've brought people together is one that we can now replicate in multiple landscapes and make that happen. Because that we've now established as a methodology. And the next 30 landscapes that will move about a third of this issue globally, we can now take this playbook to and try to replicate this model. And so what we're trying to do is not just solve it in one place, which in itself would be incredible, to try to bring folks together and stack that, but to create a replicable model for doing this kind of place-based collaboration around the world.
Shalini, thank you. And that's going to be a perfect segue in a second to that conversation between and toggling between local versus, globally scaled. And just emphasizing what you're saying too, in terms of we kind of already, there's no mystery around which part of this work is most appropriate for philanthropic and concessionary funds. Yet people are just naturally, as you're saying, average of 1.5 partners are not aware or, have the capacity or whatever it might be to learn from and build on the momentum of other activities and momentum that are going on in their space, and how we can use these philanthropic dollars and in turn some of this strategic philanthropic partnership, again, sort of beyond financing, to help these players reorganize themselves in a way that's much more systematic and strategic, to drive that change in that local context, and then to your point, be able to replicate that in others. Before I sort of move on to, and again, you've all sort of provided such rich insights here. Sarah, anything that you want to build on, or James, in terms of the de-risking before I keep us moving? And again, you can always interrupt whenever you have something.
Maybe one potentially interesting lever for de-risking in some ways and leveraging is, you have philanthropy and then you have increased yields and market income on either end, right? So you want some help to farmers and farming and food systems, and then some, and in between there, I think that there's an underappreciated role for tapping climate finance in a smart and concerted way. And the argument being that if we can get particularly smallholders who have traditionally been excluded from kind of emissions intensive agriculture to be better stewards of the climate as well as producers of food, there's a huge climate externality. So the way that could go is some philanthropic capital to invest in beginning that pivot to regenerative approaches and sustainable agriculture, generate some amount of carbon revenue. The reason that's a de-risking tool is that oftentimes what you're spending on early on is stuff you're paying for in hard currency, and carbon and climate related revenue comes in hard currency, so not local currencies from local food markets. So you can actually match streams there. And that then allows you, having made that catalytic investment, whether it's in pyrolyzer or whether it's in other kinds of equipment, to then let that flow through and actually have farmers and rural communities benefit in the form of higher yields and ideally preferred market access elsewhere. So it's that addition of, and thinking about the world of pure philanthropy and the world of externality-based carbon financing as somehow working in tandem. It's the work that organizations like the Climate Action for Smallholders Coalition, the Cash Collective, have been working on to really try and see how do we get these transmission mechanisms to actually work well and lever up $1 of philanthropic capital into 10 of climate financing into 100 of farmer income.
Yeah, and sort of that amplifier effect that it can offer. Thanks for that. And as we continue in this conversation, I do want to double down a little bit on this localized versus global conversation. And also very quickly, I realize we have 10 minutes left, which is bananagrams. I certainly have plenty more questions, so I'm not going to have any issues asking more in this last 10 minutes. But if you do, I invite all of you who are listening in, if there are questions that you want to make sure we answer today, if we can. So don't be shy on that front. But localized versus global, and what I mean by that in this work too is there's, and as James was saying, a lot of externalities, and also the philanthropists themselves, again, not just this monolith of, the philanthropist as this single being operating through space. And Sarah, maybe you can speak to this too. Philanthropists have interest areas. Philanthropists have preferences. Philanthropists have different, change models in the work that they're doing, which I think, historically has been underutilized, but definitely is an opportunity here when we're toggling between, the Gates Foundations of the world, the Rockefellers, the Ford Foundations play a really important role, as sort of those larger rocks and boulders within this work. But there's huge opportunity for local family foundations or family offices, even corporate philanthropy to play a role in this. And so for whoever is inspired by the question, jump in with me in terms of how it feels like we can optimize on this to be able to account for the local versus regional or global contexts.
I can jump in. I'll speak more to the funder side, less the global local. I'll have the rest of the panelists address that. I think your point is important, Eva. There is a lot of interest. And if we're looking at this coalition, I think it's a lot easier to both identify and align private sector incentives than it is philanthropic ones because there's such a mix. And so there's a lot more work to be done in getting philanthropic capital to the table because you have to think about the different profiles of what motivates a funder and why they should be interested in this. What were they interested in before? Is there a transition? There's just a bit more hand-holding in that process. And that's one of the things that we're hoping to address as a convener across the capital stack of just philanthropy to help incentivize and get people excited about why this is a strategic place to invest, or how that's a strategic place to invest, or how you're already investing is in the system. Can you become part of the system from a coordination perspective? So just naming that as one of the challenges in getting to even Shalini's point, that 15%, it might be a little harder than the other parts of the capital, but really important. So making the case is on our side such a critical part of this.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I think that just validates the point too of the philanthropic community and those who support funders in helping with the narrative around that to help them understand. And I say this in my work all the time, how do we reposition this work and these solutions as solutions to problems that these funders are already preoccupied with solving? And there's so many lenses to them. Other colleagues, any thoughts to build on that?
Maybe just I'm happy to come in because you referenced this earlier, and I didn't get into the sort of branding of different initiatives because I try to veer away from that, but I will go into it just because I do think this platform that the forum has launched in the last couple of years called Gaia, which is basically an acronym for Giving to Amplify Earth Action, is trying to, within the climate and nature space in particular, basically bring a bit of that coordination amongst the philanthropic sector, but very much alongside public-private partnerships, right? To say, like, what is that value of that fourth P along with some of the parameters we've been talking about. So I think to your point, Sarah, how do you coordinate a more strategic, organized sort of way to understand there's not a homogenous sort of sector here, but there are strengths to leverage. There's a coordination strategy that could really amplify the sort of niche and wider impacts that are interesting for each of those institutions, but as a collective. And at the forum, I think they're trying to harness some of the, let's say, early mover philanthropy, community that's already looking at that alongside public-private partnerships. So they're doing that in a few places. They've unlocked something like $5 billion in the first 3 years around sort of net zero and nature-specific areas. In food, we have yet to fully tap into that. So what I'm excited about this conversation is to also have the compelling narrative, but the tools required, because I don't think we should underestimate building these 4P partnerships, and the food systems are so straightforward. And yet I do find, going back to what everybody said in the beginning, the multifaceted nature of investing in food really does offer like a seat at the table for a very diverse group of folks to come together. I personally have found my engagement with folks that are looking at the long-term investing and the long-term returns to bring that long-term vision to an otherwise very short-term harvest cycle discussion. And that is a default setting that we continue to be plagued by in our sector. So, again, I know I'm not the expert in this group on how to sort of, solve for the 4Ps in food. I just think there's more than just capital you bring to the table. And I think we have to sit down and really think through what that set of expertise could do for the planning of these long-term engagements.
Yeah. Thank you, Tania. And I think really speaks to what we've heard in terms of the more strategic role that philanthropy can play beyond just the check. Believe it or not, we have 4 minutes. And so I'm just going to jump right into the lightning round of this discussion as we close out. And again, hopefully closing out just this 1 hour conversation, but hopefully will be built on in a variety of different capacities. For each of you, let's see, I'll start maybe with Shalini, James, Tania, and then end with Sarah. If you had to make a case to a funder to prioritize food systems as a top investment area, what would your key what would your key argument be? And maybe putting aside the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Gates, what would be your case for these funders? What should they know about the excitement and opportunity within food systems?
Okay, this is I'll give it a shot. Maybe
Choose one for
the
3
answer
minutes.
is we all got to eat, but maybe I'll do something more elaborate
Good one.
and live. It is there is no getting to climate outcomes without addressing the challenges in the food systems. There is no surviving and getting to nutrition outcomes without transforming the food system. There is no economic growth for many countries in the world and many communities without a transformed food system. And so irrespective of which angle of entry you as a philanthropist are coming into it, what the food system offers is a moment where for a long time we have had fractures in this food system because it is not structured in a way that serves us as humanity for our food needs, doesn't serve the farmers, doesn't serve us on many of the dimensions we want to. Here's a moment for change. It's multidimensional, it's complex, but there are many outcomes that can come out of single interventions. And so if you're a philanthropist looking to drive systems change, this is one of the places that's really ripe for intervention.
Oh, golden nugget. James, I know it's hard. 30 seconds. What would your argument be for a philanthropic funder in this space?
I think the very reason that makes food systems such a tricky and wicked driver of global emissions, those negative, vicious cycles and feedback loops, is what makes it a really exciting place, exactly as Shalini said, where you can see that that there are really interesting positive feedback loops and virtuous cycles that can come from actually identifying a new pathway and getting people onto it, one that is actually good for farmer incomes, yields, and the planet all at the same time. But that first step does require a firm push in a new direction.
Amazing. Tania.
I'll do it in 15 seconds instead of 30. How's that? No, I think you both said it way better than I could. I guess my sort of advice right now for those looking is that we aren't looking for alternatives and solutions. We know everything we need to do right
Yes,
now. We don't need the alternative to flying around the world in food. You don't have to help mobilize through market demand signals new clean tech for food. I mean, we would welcome it, but we know today what we need to do. So it's really more about mobilization than anything else. And I think hopefully that's compelling enough because I think people are really underestimating the urgency to act.
brilliant, Tanya. Thank you. Sarah, what are you going to do in your conversations to excite your funder members?
Well, hosting more conversations like this, and I'll maybe pause on that before wrapping it up on it. The other piece I wanted to throw in is that, like Shalini said, it is very personal. We all have to eat. And it is about the security of our future. We haven't touched on the security side and the peace side and how this is very interconnected to that fragility. So that would be the additional case I'd make for why a resilient food system is an important place to be investing.
Good. That's a great one, and grateful that we have somebody like you in that sphere of influence with philanthropists to be able to excite and connect them in this space. I cannot thank you all enough. We are 1 minute over, but this was exactly the conversation I think all of us needed. I cannot thank my panelists, my colleagues, my friends for joining this conversation today, and just grateful. And hopefully this inspires everyone to think about the existing tools we have in our toolboxes. And to Tanya's point, we already know the solutions. We know exactly where we can put these philanthropic dollars. How are we going to do this in a more organized and systematic way? So I invite everyone to connect if there's specific asks, needs, leads, anything that you would like from this conversation and building forward, and anything we heard from our panelists that you'd like to learn more about. Of course, I'm always here to help support those connections. So thank you, dear friends, for joining this conversation today.
Thank you very much. It's fun.
Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you for
everyone.
excellent moderation.
Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Eva. Great job.
Thank you. And if before everybody leaves, can I take a quick snap before? Okay, give me a 1, 2, 3. Amazing. Thank you. Thanks so much, friends. This was great. I
Thanks.
really appreciate it.
You.
Bye.
Bye.